Thank you, gentlemen. You are dismissed.
Liz is going to talk about 3 grant topics that are not talked about very often. This morning, he will discuss his siblings, his life with Julia, and his sense of humor. Our first topic will be the stories of his siblings. Again, welcome, Kurt.
Well, I'm going to sit down some of this, I expect, but most of our time together today, I'm going to be standing. And I would like to thank Colonel Perry Salyers. Where are you, Colonel? Right here. Colonel is one of the newest members of the association and what you people are keeping alive for me in your history. Stand, Colonel Salyers. You are dismissed. Be seated. Colonel Salyers and I met this morning quite inadvertently. He came in and asked Dr. Lodwick, may I take coffee into the auditorium? And Dr. Lodwick said, yes, of course. And when he walked out the door, I said, get a big one. And he said, do you want one? And I said, no, I don't think so. And then about the time he got out the door, I said, I can't believe I just turned down a cup of coffee. And I moved with great alacrity out the door and yelling at it as he walked down the sidewalk. Yes, I want one too. 1 coffee, 2 sugars. And lo, he brought it back. So I've greatly enjoyed some coffee, Colonel, and I promoted him to Colonel, and he'll be a member of my staff. He might have gotten into more than he wanted to with a cup of coffee. Well, I was asked when I came back, this place remained my home, was always my home, and I was asked to wear my uniform. Now, you know, I've been the president, but as the president, I was rarely ever addressed as Mr. President, except from somebody outside the country. I was always addressed by people in the country as general. And I was asked to wear my uniform, and I'm very pleased to tell you it still fits, does it not? And Julia, before I came here, Julia did a couple of things. And where is Julia? Stand up, Julia. Julia Grant. And Julia brought a couple of her lady friends. Would you, lady friends, please stand? Aren't they lovely? Those dresses, even I'm impressed with the dresses. Well, Julia told me a couple of things. She said, Liz, I keep telling you, when you talk to people, stand up straight and keep your hands out of your pockets. And I can't do either. Now, I was taught to stand up straight at the academy, and when I came home on my first leave after 2 years, now you know in the academy in those days, I entered the academy in 1839, and in those days you went 2 years before you got a leave. And after my 2 years, I came home, and my mother immediately remarked, why, Liz, you're standing up straighter than you usually do, or than you used to. And I said, yes, Mother, that's one of the first things they taught us at the academy, stand up straight. Of course, our trousers were as tight as bark on a tree, and I never liked those. They were white duck, and they were so tight that I was always afraid that they were going to split like a thunderclap when I walked across the campus. Never cared for the uniform. But something else that Julia did was, when I was president, I never told Julia what I was going to do, what I was going to say. And even as I wrote my inaugural address, I kept it in my coat pocket. Julia kept asking me, what are you going to say for your inaugural? And I would always reply, I'm working on it. Well, I want to see it. And I said, I am working on it. The pronoun there, Julia, is I am working on it. Well, I want to see it. And I never told her about it, and I kept it in my breast pocket because I knew that if Julia got hold of my inaugural address, she was going to rewrite it. And if I didn't deliver what she had rewritten, I'd have a miserable presidency. So she gave me a list. I kept this one, and I've got my list of things, because she said, what are you going to talk about today, Liz? And I said, well, this and that, some old stories and some things that happened to me in St. Louis and about mother and father and so forth. And she said, have you written down your list? And I said, no, I haven't written down a list. And so it wasn't long before she came up with a list. So being the wise husband, you know, there's a difference between wise and smart. Smart is good intellect. Wise is doing what that intellect may not always tell you to do. So I'm a wise husband, and I have my list. And I'm going to move around from time frame to time frame, but I want to talk about my parents and my relationship with mother and father, such as it was. My mother and father, Jesse, as you know, was about 6 feet tall. I'm 5'8", and my father was about 6 feet, maybe 6'1", and a big man. The genes did not transfer to me. And he and mother married in 1821. Mother came from a fairly well-to-do family, the Simpsons, who had moved in from western Pennsylvania, and then they went to Philadelphia. Then grandfather Simpson bought about a 650-acre farm here just outside of town here. And my father had come down and was working in Point Pleasant, and he moved over when he decided to go into business for himself. He finished his apprenticeship in the tannery business. He came here, he met my mother and began courting my mother. And it was a good match. Daddy is a big man and blustery. He never stops talking. My mother is a little person, about 5'1", and she never talks. So they were a good match. Father never shuts up, mother never opens her mouth. And my father is, he's been described as difficult, abrasive, never abusive. In fact, as far as abusive is concerned, neither one of my parents ever struck me, never whipped me or any of my 5 brothers and sisters. Punishment, physical punishment, was not permitted in the Grant household. And they married in 1822, and then in April of 23, they married in June of 22. I was born the 27th of April in 22. They married in 21. And there's a myth that has grown to legendary proportions that I should like to squelch. The legend is, the myth that grew to a legend is that I weighed, some say 10 pounds and some say 11 pounds. Now let me go back and repeat, my mother was 5'1", 5'2", slightly built. And there is, particularly after I've fathered 4 children with Julia and gone through that process, with the exception of Buck, who was born in Bethel. The other 3 children were born in Whitehaven. And I was there for the birth of my last 2 children. And I came to realize, as much as a man can, that an 11-pound baby from a 5'1" woman, particularly her first child, is just not going to happen. And it would have killed mother and me too. The reality is that Dr. Rogers, who delivered me, told my father, he said, Jesse, you better watch that little fellow. He's kind of sickly and he may not make it. So that is not an 11-pound baby or a 10-pound baby. So you may put that to rest. And when I was born, there were no birth certificates. I don't have a birth certificate. And there were no scales to weigh babies in a delivery in a small clapboard house over at Point Pleasant. So we have to go with what Dr. Rogers said, and he said, better watch that little fella. He's kind of sickly and he may not make it. It may be that he was talking about I may not make it through the night. But I did, and I was a small child, as you might understand. I'm not a big man now. But when I was just a boy, I didn't talk much, and because I always felt if you don't have anything to say, don't say it. Don't just jack your jaws and run your mouth, as many of my school chums would do. And I was viewed as slow because I didn't talk. And Father would take me everywhere he went, everywhere. I was his firstborn. About every 2 years there came the other 5. But Father took me everywhere he went, and he was in a store down here on Main Street. I don't recall which one it was, but I was about 2 years old. And I vaguely remember it because of what happened. One of his friends came in the store and had one of these horse pistols, and I'm playing and doing what that little fellow over there is doing. And one of the men came in with the big horse pistol, and he said, "Has that boy ever heard a gun go off?" And Father said, "Why, no, I don't think he has." He said, "Let's let him hear one go off." And Father said, "Certainly." So he pulls that horse pistol out, fires out the door right next to me, and to see what I'd do. Now, parenting has changed since then, I think, but I just jumped and giggled, and I said, "Fick it again, fick it again." And everybody was, I think, impressed, and my father certainly was. He kept saying, "That boy's going to amount to something." Yes, sir. Someday that boy's going to be somebody. And the other fellows around town that he's talking to would say, "That boy ain't going to do nothing. That boy is slow." Well, Father was garrulous and set up, well, he was self-educated. He'd learned to read. He'd had about 6 months of education up in Ravenna, Ohio, up north, and lived for 2 years with the Brown family. And he was 17, 18 years old. But one of the Browns was John Brown. That John Brown. And Father lived with them for a couple of years. And he told me after I became an adult, of course, John Brown did what he did at Harper's Ferry. He said that, of course, he enjoyed talking about it because Father likes to be the center of attention. Quite opposite of how I feel. But he said John Brown was, even at 12 years old, he was eccentric. Good kid, sharp kid, intelligent boy, but he was eccentric. He would focus on things maniacally, focus on issues or things and be obsessive about it. So he would then go on to say, "I'm not surprised that he did what he did at Harper's Ferry." But Father lived with the Brown family. He also lived with the Todd family, 1D. Now, Mrs. Lincoln came from the Todd family, 2Ds. And President Lincoln has even told me, he said, I don't know why they had 2Ds in their name, except now they think God ordained that they should have 2. God even has just 1D. But those people have 2Ds. So Mary Todd. But he also lived with justices of the Ohio State Supreme Court, Todd, who later became Governor Todd. And Mrs. Todd took in the boy they'd hired. Of course, he was a big fellow. Now, he's 6 feet tall. Time he's 18, 19 years old, he's a big man. And he hired on as a farmhand. And while he's still deciding what he's going to do and get into, he decided pretty much to go into tanning. And, of course, you know, we live in a world of wood and cast iron that's held together by rope and leather. So a man who makes leather will always have a living. And he was thinking about going to that, but Mrs. Todd took him under her wing and taught, because he was asking her all manner of things. She would be reading the classics, Greek or Roman classics. And Father would ask her, tell me this story. Tell me this. And she said, "You read it." And he said, well, I can't read. I can't read very well, barely read. And so she spent several months teaching Father how to read. He caught fire with reading, and he became largely self-educated. Now, when they married, my mother, who was very well educated, which now is unusual, you must keep in mind, in the 1820s, it was not fashionable to teach a woman how to read. Women didn't know how to read. All a woman needs to know is have babies and keep house. That's all you need to know. But some far-sighted individuals realized that their daughters need to be educated, not stultified and limited in their thinking. And our grandfather Simpson was such a man. My mother could even play the piano. Well, Mother taught Father even more of how to read and work with him. Now, if you go to our home this day, you can see the bookshelf that Father had. Father had 25 or 30 books. Now, can you believe that? He had 25 or 30 books that were his. Now, he had more books than the local library, such as it was. And he was consumed with Greek and Roman mythology, which hence part of my name, Ulysses. And if you have not read Greek or Roman mythology, I urge you to do so. They're great stories, wonderful stories and easily read. But Father took reading lessons from Mother. Then he got into politics, such as he did. And he wrote poems. Now, you may have seen in the Castigator, and I've said before, I will say here and I'll say again, why in the world would anybody name a newspaper the Castigator? That sounds a bit aggressive. And whichever side of the aisle that his politics may have been, the editor, you know it's going to be rough. But Father would do his own advertising. And I invite you to look up some old copies. You may have some old copies of the Castigator, but go back and read some of Father's poetry. It was awful. It was awful. And but many, Mother would tell him that's not very good poetry, but nobody else would. And he liked to argue. Well, he put that argument bent to good use, and he organized debate clubs, which ultimately resulted in my U.S. Army issue name. Because he and Tom Hamer, y'all know Tom, you know Tom Hamer, redhead? Well, yeah, okay. So Tom Hamer came from western Pennsylvania too. Now, the town is populated by people from Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and mainly western Pennsylvania. And Hamer came down as a teacher, and he read law once he got. So many of those teachers become lawyers. And he read law while he was here and teaching. So he's in a debate one evening with Father, and you picture the scene, lantern light, a lot of men because women didn't do that, a lot of men in a relatively small room, a lot of pipe smoke, cigar smoke, like this. And they're talking about, of all things, they're arguing about Andy Jackson and the National Bank. Now, Andy, who was, he's pretty firm in his opinions, Democrat, he said that the country has no business being involved in banking. And that was a debate topic. Now, my father, who's a businessman, and Father did well. He had a tannery. He had about a 65 acre farm. He had a livery stable business. He had a delivery pickup business. Now, we weren't wealthy, but we were very comfortable. And witness the brick house. My father wouldn't have anything else but a brick house, because what does a brick house say? I've got money. So Father built that first section, then the second section, then the third section. For a while I had my own bedroom until the next baby came along. I believe it was Orville. and bumped me out of my own bedroom, and I had to start sharing a room again. But the house is a maze of rooms. But Father gets up and he says, he's a businessman, and he said, we need to have a national bank, because a businessman is, of course, going to want to have money flowing in the economy. Well, Tom Hamer, who Father and Tom were both Whigs, going to be Democrats, and Tom Hamer stands up, and he had the opposite, and said the United States should not be involved in a national bank. Well, Tom Hamer is a lawyer. He doesn't have to deal with supply and sales and hiring people and being sure you stock what people want and so forth. He was a businessman, not a businessman, he was a lawyer. So he was opposed, he really was opposed to a national bank. And they almost came to blows. They became very impassioned, as it was described, and had to be separated. And Father, being Father, began to write this poetry and put it in the Castigator. And it was thinly veiled about insulting Tom Hamer. He even wrote an article. He said, if you want a friend, don't go to Tom Hamer. He put that in the paper. Don't go to Tom Hamer. If you see Tom Hamer coming, cross the street and walk on the other side of the street. Dad, Father says some hard things about Hamer. Now, Hamer, though, as you know Tom, he had the reputation of the Good Samaritan, because one particular instance, a fellow that they had some bad words between them, had, I believe it was his wagon was broke down on the side of the road, and Hamer comes riding along, and this fellow's sitting on his wagon, and Hamer said, well, what's your problem? Well, your wheel's off of it. And the fellow said, yeah, I need a little help here. I'm broke down, and I'm out here alone. And Hamer said, well, come on, get on the horse with me. Let's go in town. We'll get you fixed up. Goes back out, gets his wagon fixed up. And this is a man who had been sneeringly insulting of Hamer, yet Hamer helped him out. Never said anything about their falling out. And afterward, they became fast friends. And it got around the community that Tom Hamer was a very forgiving man and got the reputation of the Good Samaritan. So, Father refuses to speak to Tom Hamer for years. And when it come time that Father wanted to get me in the academy, aren't they great? You got to watch them. They get away from you. I'm glad you're here. Bringing the little ones is the best thing you can do. The little ones are the future of our past. So Hamer winds up getting himself in Congress, and Father had to ask him to get the appointment for me to the academy. And Hamer said, well, sure. Now, I've talked about this before, but I want to emphasize. Tom Hamer, instead of saying, looking at a letter and seeing Jesse Grant on it and in the trash can, something as important as an appointment to the United States Military Academy. Now, mind you, it was the only academy in existence at that time. Now, in 1845, the Naval Academy opened, but that was the academy opened in 1802, and 27 years later, or 29 years later, 27 years later, 37 years later, I was going to get the appointment in 39. It was of profound significance. This was a life-changing decision. And Tom Hamer could have easily remembered, well, Jesse Grant smeared me in the newspaper. He downgraded me at every opportunity. He was just evil about his anger at me. And yet, he did none of that. And he immediately sat down and wrote the appointment for me to the United States Military Academy. And there are those who will tell you that changed our history. That's not for me to say. But he let me in the academy with no hesitation. Well, now that's where a problem comes in. because how long has it been since he and Father have spoken to each other? 10 years. So he knew that he thought my first name was Ulysses, because people called me Ulyss. My first name's Hiram, pulling my name out of a hat in a family meeting, but Tom put down Ulysses, and he thought my middle name was my mother's maiden name, which was customary, Simpson, so he put S. Now see, he further obfuscated the issue. He didn't write Simpson. So when you hear somebody address me or talk about me as Ulysses Simpson Grant, if you can, tell them that's not his name. Simpson is not, nor has it ever been, a part of his name, because even the man that appointed me didn't write Simpson. He wrote S, period. The Simpson thing is something that was created after I got to the academy, and Tom Hamer talked about it, I guess, and Simpson became plugged in the middle of my name. I always maintained it stands for nothing. What does the S in your name stand for? It stands for nothing, or whatever you want it to stand for. Even when our son Buck was born, his name is Ulysses S. Grant Jr., not Simpson. We named him Ulysses S. Grant Jr., like my name has become. And I've written Julia 2 or 3 letters over the years. What does the S stand for in Buck's name? I have no idea. I've got a child with an initial that I don't know what it means, and I'm his father. So, Simpson, let's put that fire out too. There's no Simpson anywhere. But Tom Hamer thought it was, and he wrote Ulysses S. Grant, and then of course that it got changed by the Army. And of course I was told the Army says your name's Ulysses S. Grant, and that's who you are. And is this not great? I've got very patient parents and some comic relief. So, I want to talk about mother. Mother, well, there's just not much to say about mother. Slight woman, very quiet. I cannot remember, and she lived until 1883. I can't remember having ever heard my mother laugh or cry. Never. Either one of them. That's hard to do. So you can see she was a very serious woman. She was a staunch Methodist. In fact, I've had folks tell me that if the Methodists had saints, Hannah Grant would be the first one. Saint Hannah. She was very patient. She was she didn't neglect me or any of my brothers and sisters, but she wasn't a hovering mother. In fact, one anecdote that I could tell you, I was about 3 years old. And of course, kids get sick. This little one back here is giggling and chuckling and running around. And you never know, tonight she could be running a fever and not feel good. It happens that fast. Well, such happened to me. And I got real sick real fast. And it worried my mother. And so she called Dr. Rogers. So Dr. Rogers comes, doctors made house calls then. Maybe you call it horse calls, because he rode his horse out there. And they're talking to me, he's talking to mother, and of course I'm lying in the bed. I'm about 3. So as all of you know, as this tot back here, a 3-year-old can communicate very well, can't they? They may not be able to, they don't have a big vocabulary, but they let you know what they want you to know, don't they? So that's the status I was in, and I felt awful. I remember that. And Dr. Rogers said, what we need to do, Hannah, I'm going to give you some powders. And I want you to give him these powders overnight tomorrow. And I sat bolt upright in the bed. And I said, no, And they both looked over at me. The doctor thought it was funny, but Mother was really concerned because I didn't act like that. That was unusual, atypical. And Mother said, well, Liz, why don't you want the powders? And I said, I don't want to blow up. Remember the fellow with the horse pistol, and I knew that powders, I thought gunpowder. And I said, oh, no, you're not giving me any of that stuff. No. Well, Mother soothed me and convinced me that it wasn't gunpowder that they were going to give me. So that was just one incident with Mother. The incident that is so well known about me swinging on the horsetails in the stable there in the yard at the house in the tannery across the road, and one of Mother's friends seeing me swinging there about 3 or 4 years old on the tail of one of these big dray horses and boats in the house and said, Hannah, Ulysses is out there swinging on the tail. He's going to kick him, it's just really exciting, going to kill him, she's going to kick him. And my mother, she said, never looked up and said, oh, this will be all right. He just understands horses and they seem to understand him. And I was never, at least as a child, I was never hurt by a horse. Now, in the Army, I was seriously injured a couple of times. Now, I want to talk about, so I'm talking about horses. Well, let me stay with Mother and Father. They didn't drink. They certainly didn't swear. There was no dancing. There was no physical punishment. A lot of no's in the house. But they loved me, all of us. We knew that, but they were not demonstrative at all in their love. I always craved a relationship, a closer relationship with Mother and Father. And I do not intend to make you think that they were cold and distant. They were not. They were stoic. Mother, even as I rose in rank, Mother never said any congratulations. She never sent me a letter saying, I'm pleased to hear this. In fact, when I came home after the surrender, I think it was June or May of '65, I came back here for a brief visit. And I walked in the house and my mother said, well, Ulysses, wiping her hands on a dish towel, I expect you are a great man now. And walked away. And that's all Mother ever said. That's all my mother ever said about my military or my political career. Does that give you an idea of how Mother conducted herself? So she and Father, though, I have to tell you the joke. I'll tell the joke on myself. It gives me no heartburn to tell this. They didn't drink, swear, dance. Like I said, there's a lot of no's in the house. But now one thing they did have in the basement was a jug, I expect it was about a gallon, of elderberry wine and some other herbs. Now, the elderberry wine, Mother and Father didn't. Mother didn't at all partake of it. Father would. But you see, it was supposed to prevent cholera. Now, we finally realized, well, we suspect that cholera comes from bad water. And it's supposed to ward off cholera, maybe dysentery. So occasionally, rarely, Father would take a sip of it, but it was always there in case there was a scare about cholera, and we could drink that. In fact, when I crossed the Isthmus of Panama in '52, when we were taking the 4th Regiment up to Oregon Territory, one of the ladies wrote letters home, and she said, Lieutenant Grant was ever-present, omnipresent, everywhere, but he never got sick because he only drank wine. And I did. I suspected that the cholera outbreaks that were, 1/3 of that party died across the isthmus. 1/3. Every child 2 years and younger died. Most of the children on the trip died. But I suspected that it may have something to do with the water. And they had some light wine there, and I always, now wine doesn't really quench your thirst, but it can. And I did not drink any of the water crossing the isthmus. I only sipped wine to keep from becoming dehydrated. And I never caught the cholera. I had a relapse of malaria, but never caught the cholera. But the elderberry wine in the basement of the house over there, I went down to the basement with some of my friends. And I assure you, I don't remember why we were in the basement. I have no idea why we were in, but we were in the basement. And lo, the jug of elderberry wine was spotted and discussed with enthusiasm. I was about 12. We were all about 12. And I think one of the white boys was with us, whites, and a couple of other fellows that had done well from Georgetown. And maybe Jake Ammon was older. Might have been Dan Ammon, Admiral Ammon now. And it was suggested, not me. I have no knowledge of how it came up. But it was suggested that we sample the elderberry wine. Well, what does it taste like? And I said, well, I don't know. I have no idea what it tastes like. Well, let's find out. So we all sipped a little elderberry wine and found it to be to our liking. And we sipped a bit. No, this isn't an anecdote where everybody becomes intoxicated, but several of us sipped the elderberry wine, and occasionally over the next few weeks, we'd slip down there when Mother and Father were busy and drink a little more of the elderberry wine. Well, as you might imagine, the gallon soon went dry. I was a little concerned at that point. But Father, after a while, Father goes down to the basement and discovered the jug was empty. So he came looking for me. Now, why me? But he came looking for me. And he set me down. Now, I'm about this big, and Father's about this big. And he asked me about the absence of the wine. And I fessed up. I immediately told him what had happened. And he pressed me, and in great detail, what had happened. And we had a long, much too long, I thought, father and son talk. I would characterize it more of a conference. But Father told me of the ills of drinking, and I took that to heart. But he most convinced me of the ills. If I catch you doing this again, you're going to be very sorry that you ever heard of elderberry wine. And there was no more sipping of the elderberry wine after that. I think there may still be a jug in that basement, but I haven't been into it. So I always wanted a relationship with my mother and father that I never got. Mother, as I said, was not cold, but she was not affectionate. She felt that God did what God does, and whatever happens to you is God's will. And if you do well in life, then it's God's will that you do well in life, and nobody else needs to say anything. That's all that needs to be said. Well, that's all that needs to be thought. God wants you to do well. Liz, you did well. It's God's will. I don't need to say anything. I don't need to say, that's good, congratulations. This is God's will. The same thing applies to the negative, sickness, illness, injury, so forth. It's just God's will. So Mother was almost stoic. Father, on the other hand, was abrasive at times. He was recognized as a good businessman. friends said, and I think they made sure that I heard them, but they said Jesse Grant would chase $1 to hell. And he did well in business. And when he left here and moved to Bethel, he did even better. Opened the store in Galena with his partner. He prospered. He became a very wealthy man by the time he retired, when he was about 65. But he would take me around, as I said earlier, and say, that boy's going to be something. But of course, when I got into school, up there at Dutch Hill School, that didn't happen so much anymore. But Father was always telling his friends that I was going to do well, and of course they almost sneered, no, he's not. There's the phrenology. You folks might have been there when the phrenology doctor came to town, and you could pay your 5 cents or half dime, and the phrenologist would examine your head and feel the bumps on your head and predict or tell you got a bad temper, you got a good temper, don't drink, you should take a little drink for medical purposes, you have great love capacity, and all manner of things. So we've since come to find out it's bunkum. But it was greatly the rage at that time. And he said he would feel the bumps. Well, when he got to us here in Georgetown, he has a meeting, and it's filled like today, and he's calling for people to come up, and he's going to read the bumps on their head. And he came to a point, well, who else would do it? Well, my father picked me up and thrust me in the aisle, go down there and do it. And I was about, I guess, 14 at the time. And I went up and I sat in a chair there on the stage like we are today. And the phrenology, this serious countenance, all serious, and he's feeling all over, which I didn't care for, but he's feeling all over my head, and all the bumps, and he stepped back. And of course, part of the dramatics, but he steps back, and he said, "Whoa, saints be," or something like that. "This boy is phenomenal. This boy is exceptional. He is going to hold the highest office in the land. Yes, sir. He's going to be in the executive mansion before his life is over." Well, the audience erupts in laughter. I was like, he thought, he didn't know what was going on because he didn't realize he said something that the audience thought was funny. But he predicted that I would someday sit in the executive mansion. And again, everybody in the audience is saying, that boy ain't going to sit nowhere but an outhouse maybe. He's not going to do anything. And I will take you to when I got the appointment to the academy. Now, Bart Bailey, Dr. Bailey, George Bailey. Bart Bailey, a year older than I am, was asked to leave the academy. He was not successful. And I was able to fill the slot that he opened. And which gives me great angst because I still have angst to this day that the failure of my best friend created the opening for me to get into the United States Military Academy. I wouldn't have gotten in otherwise. Well, when the word got out here in Georgetown that I'd been appointed to the academy, people were openly grumbling. In one instance, my father is walking down Main Street to go into one of the stores, and there were several men sitting on the benches there passing the time of day, and one of them said, "Jesse, I hear that Hamer appointed your boy to go to the academy, West Point." And Father swelled with pride. He said, yes, he did. Yes, he did. This he's leaving directly. And then the fellow said, well, why did he waste an appointment like that on a boy like yours? He should have given it to somebody that was going to be a success, not Ulysses or useless. And that took my father, he was taken aback a bit about that. But that was the general reaction about my appointment to the academy. Nobody thought I was going to make it. Neither did I. So let me reminisce about St. Louis. When I resigned from the Army in 1854 and moved to St. Louis, Julia and I married and promptly started having a family. Had a baby in a year or so, then another baby in a couple of years. And I was farming. Now, her father, Colonel Dent, gave Julia, not me, gave Julia 60 acres of timber, not farmland, timber, oak timber, that had to be cleared first before it could be farmed. And he didn't give a title to it. He didn't legally give her the property. He just, it's yours. He didn't give it to me because, remember, the laws were that the husband owned everything. And he didn't want her to marry me to start with. He said, I'm useless. He's never going to amount to anything. And if he'd given me the title as a wedding gift, he was afraid I'd sell the land. So he gave it to Julia, but still gave her no title. So I was living on a farm that I didn't own. And I had to clear the timber first. And so I was working by myself, or I would rent a slave for 35 cents a day. Now, the going rate was 25 cents a day. But I would pay more than the going rate locally because I really wanted them to work and I appreciated them working with me. And not only were my neighbors upset that I was paying the rental rate higher than the going rate, but I was in the field working with them. And that was a real mistake, social mistake. You don't get in the field and work with the slaves, but I did because I had to get that job done, and I didn't have any problems working with them. So I was developing a little bit of the angst of my neighbors. And we were at a dance one evening, and Julia loves to dance. She plays a good piano and loves to trip the light fantastic, as it said. And she's dancing. Well, I'm tone deaf. I don't like music. And I surely don't want to dance. And I'm called to mind of President Lincoln, who he loves to tell the story about asking Mary Todd to dance, and Mary Todd later, and she loved to tell the story too at every opportunity, that Mr. Lincoln said, I want to dance with you in the worst way, and he promptly did that throughout the dance. But I would go to the side room. They'd have the barn dance or the town dance in the large building. And I'd go with the men, and we'd play cards and smoke and talk. Well, there was a loudmouth on one particular night who had gotten a little too much popsicle. And it doesn't take much, but he'd gotten a little too much popsicle, and he was actually causing a disturbance there in the dance and saying some things he ought not to say, some profanity. And a fairly good-sized man must have had 4 inches on me. And nobody was doing anything, and he's being very offensive. And I watched it and saw that nobody else was going to do anything because, I was new to the community. We'd only been there a year or so, and I didn't want to assume any properties that I ought not to. But this fellow was becoming outrageous, insulting. And I walked up to him and said, this needs to stop. You've had too much to drink. You need to leave. And he looked down at me and puts his hands on his hips and he said, and who's going to make me? And the next thing he knew, I'd hit him upside the head, knocked him down, picked him up by his belt, or where his belt would have been, his collar, and ran him out the door, down the sidewalk, and through the gate. And he's tumbling and rolling. Now that caused some eyebrows to rise. First of all, they thought, Grant took on this big guy. I wasn't concerned. I knew I was stronger than he was, and I was meaner than he was, and he was drunk. So I confronted him, and I knew that I doubted he'd come back, but if he'd come back, he'd have gotten some more of what he got the first time. So I picked him up and ran through him out. Dance continued, And I found out later I had attained something of a greater status in the area. But another time, I told you about clearing those 60 acres of oak trees. So I'm out cutting down trees, and I've got to clear enough. That first year, spring of 55, I got back. Julia and I married in August of 54, so the fall of 54 and spring of 55, I've got to get some of that land cleared so I can put a crop in. Subsistence crop. We needed something to eat, and Colonel Dent and Ellen Dent, Mrs. Dent, he was not inclined to help us out in a tough time, and Mrs. Dent was. He didn't like me. Mrs. Dent liked me. But I had to get that farm in. So as I'm furiously cutting timber and going into St. Louis to sell it at $4 the cord, I'm working like the beaver, proverbial beaver. Well, I'm stacking my wood, and I'm coming back. I've been doing it for a few weeks. And then one particular morning, things in your life, you don't notice them until they change. And when you see something different, the drip gets loud enough, or the leak becomes big enough, or something happens that you take notice. Well, I came back to the woods there, my wood pile, and I noticed my pile is not as big as it was yesterday. And I thought, that's when it occurred to me, this pile hasn't been getting as big as it ought to, a cord of wood, 2 cords of wood, as it ought to. And I thought, somebody's stealing my wood. So that night, I worked all day, stacked my wood up so I could take it in St. Louis the next morning. But that night, I secreted myself in the trees. Had my gun, and I was sitting there just waiting. Now, maybe something's going to happen, maybe it won't. But lo, about midnight, here comes the footsteps through the woods. And a fella, I knew who he was, a fella has a team of mules, backs them up to my wood pile, and begins loading them. So I let him load the wagon. And then I walked out of the woods and said, hey! And of course, he almost has apoplexy. And I've got the gun too. But I said, you're stealing my wood. Well, no, I'm blah, blah, blah. I said, don't try to cover it up. You're stealing my wood. Well, what are you going to do now? And I said, I'll tell you what we're going to do now. You're going to take that wagon load of wood to my home, and you're going to transfer the wood to my wagon, and then you're going to go home. And you're never coming back here and steal my wood again, are you? And he said, no, Captain Grant. I was called Captain Grant. No, Captain Grant. No. You're not going to call the sheriff? No. I'm not going to call the sheriff. Now, if you come out here and do it again, we'll call the sheriff. We'll have a talk with him. But tonight, you're going to transfer all that wood to my wagon, and then you're going home, never to come back again. And he cheerfully did that. And the next morning I got up, and Julia had heard something outside. And she said, Liz, what was going on last night? And I told her. And she laughed, and she said, you didn't have him arrested? No. I made, and this is something I consistently did. I said, darling, I made my point. I scared him to death. Now, yes, I had the weapon, which I would never have used on him. But I scared him to death. He was caught red-handed, and he was grateful, actually, that I didn't call the sheriff, because he could have done time in the county farm for that. And he went home, and I said, I don't think he's ever going to steal my wood again, and he didn't. And then I take the wood in town, about 8 miles, and when I'm riding on the wagon that particular day, because I didn't have a full load, and a general that I had known in Mexico in the old army As I'm riding along, he's leading a contingent of troopers from Jefferson Barracks out, and he glances up on the wagon and reins his horse in, stops the troop, and he leaned on his saddle and he said, "Lieutenant Grant, is that you, Grant?" And I said, "Yes, sir, it is. It is me in the flesh." "Well, what in the world are you doing, Grant?" And I said, "I am busily fighting the war against poverty." And he said, I see that. Are you all right?" And I said, I'm a little ragged. I still had my Army uniform because I couldn't afford new clothes. So I'd taken my waistcoat and cut the Army buttons off and put civilian buttons on it. And I had a little cool that morning, so I had my greatcoat on, which now is threadbare and worn and turned dark blue, had turned gray. And my boots were worn out. I wore my Army boots because my neighbors even said, they wrote letters there in diaries. They said, "Captain Grant wears boots that are not common to this area." Now, of course, I know you folks never paid any attention to anybody else's shoes, but my neighbors did. And what they were talking about was my knee-high boots, Army boots. I couldn't afford any other shoes. So I wore my Army boots, my old Army trousers, converted my military waistcoat to a civilian, and that's how the general saw me. He said, "I remember you well, Grant. You did well in the war." And I said, "I tried, General." He said, and you're faring well?" And I said, "I am indeed." And he said, "Well, take care of yourself. It's good to see you at Grant. Be about your business." And I said, "And to you, General." Cracked the rein a little bit, and horses pulled me on into St. Louis, where I sold the wood. Another time I went into St. Louis. Now remember, Jefferson Barracks is there. And if you've never been to Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis, I urge you to go. You really ought to spend a half a day or so at Jefferson Barracks. It was so central to our military history that out of all the West Point graduates who fought in the Civil War, 306 went south, and about 650 went north. But out of all that 1,000 generals that fought, West Point graduates that fought in the Civil War, only one out of 1,000, only one did not have an assignment to Jefferson Barracks. Now, I know you're wondering, I'm pausing a little bit to build up suspense, but the one West Point graduate out of the 1,000 that fought in the Great War who did not have an assignment to Jefferson Barracks was Thomas Jonathan Jackson. Now, my Confederate veteran, where's my Confederate veteran? Is he? He's out with the baby. You saw in my escort, we had a Confederate veteran who rode with Forrest. And if you see him after this morning is over, speak to him because he has a Forrest medal which designates I rode with Forrest, which is quite a distinction. Because I've said many times, Forrest was the best cavalry leader that either side produced in the war. I also then said, I regret he didn't have an opportunity to test his mettle against Phil Sheridan. I should like to have seen the outcome of that. But going into Jefferson Barracks, I was there selling wood, and I was there before the war. In fact, that's how I met Julia when I went out there from the academy. But in being in St. Louis, I was trying to farm and going broke, and then I saw Sherman. I'm walking down the street. It was 58, I think. And I'm walking down the street there in St. Louis. I'm a little threadbare. And I walked into come see Sherman. And I leaned back. I said, "Comp Sherman." And he looked at me and said, "Uncle Sam Grant." Now, he's the one that hung me with that name, because when they posted our names after we were admitted, it had Ulysses S. Grant, and Sherman is the one who ran his finger, because he was a senior classman in the 4th class, and the last year. He ran his finger down there, because I've been told by several of those fellows that were there, ran his finger down that list of names and stopped at Ulysses S. Grant and said, looks like we got ourselves an Uncle Sam Grant. Well, now, for a while, they called me United States Grant. And I was okay with that. And for a while, they called me Uncle Sam Grant. And I was okay with that. For a while, they called me the girl. I was not okay with that. But it became Uncle Sam. Then it just became Sam. And Sherman is walking down the street. Now, what had happened that brought us together in that serendipitous meeting? I had gone back to St. Louis, and I told my friends, when fellow officers, when I left the Oregon Territory, Fort Humboldt, California, that if you come looking for me in 10 years, all you've got to do is go to St. Louis, Missouri, and look for a wealthy old country gentleman farmer. Well, things didn't quite work out that way, but that's another day. And and I resigned in April 11th of 54. Sherman had also resigned in 54. Sherman, McClellan, Halleck, the list goes on of Army officers who resigned in 1854. But Sherman resigned to go into banking, some national bank. I don't recall the name of it. But he became an officer in a bank. Well, the bank collapsed. He was in California, and they closed that branch. They were based in New York. He went back to New York City, and they were about to close that down, but they had a branch in St. Louis. They sent Sherman to St. Louis to close that branch. So we're standing there on the boardwalk, smoking and passing the time of day. And he said, what are you doing here? And I told him a little bit of my story. I hadn't done well at farming. And I asked him, what are you doing here? And he said, well, I'm closing out the last branch of the bank that's in New York City. And when I go back to New York City, they're closing the bank there altogether. So we commiserated back and forth about what hard times were. And Sherman said something interesting. He said, you know, West Point, Grant, was not a good school to train people to be farmers or bankers. And I said, no, it wasn't, was it, Come? We shook hands, and I said, well, I've got to be on my way and sell some more wood. And Sherman said, and I must be about my business, and closed the bank. I didn't see Sherman again until November of 61, when I went to Cairo, Illinois, and took command of the District of Southeast Missouri and Southeast Illinois, and such of Kentucky as I might be able to control. Now, if that's not vague enough for you, I don't know what is. Such of Kentucky as you may be able to control. Well, and it was there that Sherman did something that's just remarkable. And we have a sergeant. Glad you could make it today. Part of my escort. Receive these men who come dressed for this. Paul, stand up. Corporal, these are among you. They are of you. They go out of their way to participate here. Thank them for their duties. Well, when I got to Cairo, a couple of things about that. In June of 61, I'd been appointed colonel of the 21st Illinois. So I was a colonel of volunteers in command of 1,000 men. On July 31st, President Lincoln, now this is 6 weeks later, requested of Secretary of War Chase, Stanton wasn't in there yet, to have my name sent to him. And I think Elihu Washburn, my Galena congressman, had a hand in it, but Lincoln specifically requested my name sent to him, and he recommended me for a brigadier general rank. Sent it to the Senate on August the 2nd, and on August the 5th they approved it. August the 9th I was notified. So within 7 weeks, I went from being a civilian to a colonel to a general. And then between August of 61 and November of 61, when I went to Cairo, Illinois, or actually you can say Cairo. Some folks there say Cairo, but Cairo, Illinois, to take command of that district. And I wrote my sister Mary. I wrote her a number of letters, but I wrote my sister Mary. She's my youngest sister. She's the one that was under Mama's apron at the end of the table when Father told me I'd gotten the appointment to the military academy. And I told Father, foolishly, Rue, you're laughing already. But Father told me, I think you've got it. And I said, got what? And he said, well, the appointment to the United States Military Academy. I have the letter. And I said, well, I won't go. That was not the correct response. So Father leaned across that table and he said, and I always love to emphasize this, he said in that voice that every one of you heard. Every one of you have heard that voice. It came out of a different mouth and it said different words, but you heard that tone. And he said, I think you will. And I said, well, if you think I will, then I think I will. But I wrote Mary Frances, and I left in May. Actually, I left in April, shortly before my birthday, and went to West Point. And she was born, I think, 2 months later. So she's my youngest sibling, my third sister, and has done well. She married a preacher and who was from Austria, and then I appointed him minister to Austria, and he wound up being a great preacher minister of the gospel, and a minister for the United States, ultimately to Switzerland. They spent 12 years in Europe. Very successful marriage, had 3 children and so forth. But I wrote Mary in November of 61 that I find myself, I'm surprised, because I find myself here in Cairo, Illinois, as a general, a brigadier general, and I am in command of more men than General-in-Chief Winfield Scott commanded in the entire Mexican War. Now, do you not find that astonishing? I certainly did. Do you not see how big that war was? And I was, at my brigadier generalship, from the general-in-chief down to me, I was 34th, I believe, in rank in the entire United States Army. That high, that fast. And I marveled, here I am, just Sam Grant. And in 7 weeks, I became a general, and in 8 more weeks, I'm in command of a military district, which we thought at that time the war was going to be in Missouri. And I'm in command of more men than the general-in-chief commanded in the entire Mexican War. I marveled at that. But the life in St. Louis was good. I want to tell you about the mule and the old man that I helped. Had a neighbor not far from where we lived. His name's not important. And he was trying to farm, subsistence farming, and I knew what a struggle was because I was struggling. I never spent more than $4 in a month to support my family, and by now we've got 4 children. And I was selling cordwood at $4 a cord and selling wood to coal mines there in the St. Louis area to shore up the tunnels. And I just couldn't make a living farming. And all the time I'm in St. Louis selling wood, or all the time I'm cutting wood, loading it and going into St. Louis, is time that I'm not spending in the farm putting in a crop. So you see the angst that I had pulling on me. So there was this old fella, and he's trying to farm. And one particular day I'm going to St. Louis to sell some wood, and he hailed me and I hailed him and pulled up, stopped the wagon, passed the time of day for a moment. I knew he lived alone, lonely. You need to have somebody to talk to when you could, and I'm talking to him. And he had bought a mule. He said, "Grant, look at my mule, this fine mule." As mules go, they're not pretty, but this was a nice one. And I'm looking at it, and I'm complimenting and slapping the rump and saying, that's a mighty fine mule you got there. He said, "Yes, sir, I paid $5 for him." And I said, "You'll do some good farming with that." Got back on the wagon and went into St. Louis. Well, the next couple of days later, I was driving back into St. Louis for sell a cord of wood, and he's sitting out there, and I don't see the mule. And I stopped the wagon, and I said, "Where's your mule?" He said, "Mule's gone." The sheriff came out and got the mule. It seemed that the lawyer that had bought the mule found something amiss in the sale of the mule and came out and reclaimed it and took it back in town. And this old fella's got no way to get a crop in the ground. And I said, "Well, how much did you pay for that mule?" He said, $5. Well, I gave him $7. That was a lot of money for me. But I gave him $7. And I said, "Go in town and buy that mule back. But this time be sure, if you can, that it's a good sale." The next day I come by, he's got the mule. A couple of days go by, and I go back with another cord of wood, and the mule's gone again. And we had the same exchange, and this time I gave him a few more dollars. I said, "Go back and buy that mule." Second time, I've given him some money. But this time, take it over into the next county where the sheriff can't get to it. And he did. Well, they got it. They came and got the mule anyway. The other sheriff got it. So the fellow still got no mule. And I said, "What are they going to do with that mule?" I'm slow to anger, but by now I'm getting angry. I said, "What are they going to do with that mule?" And he said, "They're going to sell it at auction." "When?" He told me where. I said, "All right." So I went to the auction. And I talked to the other fellows. We all knew each other. And I told everybody in that auction what I was there and what I was doing, why I was there. And they all nodded. So when that mule came up for auction, the auctioneer said, "What am I bid for this mule?" Not a sound. Nobody bid. Nobody. He said, "What am I bid for this mule?" Hit that auction block, gavel. "It's a fine mule. What am I bid for it?" Nobody said it. In fact, people turned and spit a chaw out, and scratched their face. Well, a third time, "What am I bid for this mule?" And I raised my hand and said, "I'll give you $1 for it." And he said, "No, this mule's worth more than $1. What am I bid for this mule?" Nobody said anything. I said, "I will give you $1. And the auctioneer looked around, and most of the men had actually turned around, looking the other way. And he said, "Sold." And I gave him $1. And I told the fellow, I let it, tied it in my wagon. I didn't tell him what I was doing. Tied it in the back of my wagon, took him back to his home, and I said, "Here's your mule." And he was just in tears. And I said, "You take this mule and get on the ferry and go across the river to Alton, Illinois, and sell that mule and buy another mule and bring him back. And let's see if the sheriff can come get this one. And you know, I never heard anything else again about that old fellow losing his mule. Well, I wanted to tell you about getting to Cairo, about Camp Sherman. By this time, Sherman is a brigadier general as well, and he's stationed up north of me from Cairo, up in the Paducah area, and was in a quartermaster role. And I was communicating with him about what I was wanting to do with moving my troops down into the Tennessee and the Cumberland River. I'm already thinking about making the moves toward Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. And Sherman sent me a letter and said, well, Grant, whatever you want to do, you tell me what you want, tell me what you need, and I will get you anything and everything you need for what you want to do. And if necessary, if you wish me to, I will subordinate myself in rank to you. Now, he outranked me, but he said, I'll subordinate myself to you in rank to get to accomplish what it is that you want to accomplish. Now, that, perhaps you've never been in the military, it doesn't make any difference. That's nothing short of astonishing for a senior man to tell a junior officer, I will subordinate myself in rank to accomplish the achievements that you have in mind. And it was at that moment that I said, Sherman is my man for as long as this war lasts, and I am his. And that's how our relationship really began. And I brought him along with what I was supposed to be doing in the war, which was to win it. Let me refer to my list here to see. Oh, Leo the dog. Leo is a Newfoundland dog. Are you familiar with that breed? It's a new breed here in the 50s in St. Louis. And my father-in-law, Colonel Dent, had a dog he named Leo. And Leo was quite the king, very regal. And the cook for the Dent family had trained Leo, and Newfoundlands are pretty good-sized dogs. She had trained Leo to catch chickens. And he was really good at it. And in fact, she could come out on the back porch and go to St. Louis and go to Whitehaven. And when you do go to Whitehaven, you can't miss it. It's Paris green. It really ought to be garish green. But it's Paris green, and it's exactly like it was when Julia and I lived there. We ultimately, when I was president, we bought the farm because the war had ruined Colonel Dent, and it was about to leave it to taxes. And we bought it while I was president. And we left it, Julia painted it that green, Paris green. But you could stand on that back porch of which I speak and look out at the backyard of what I'm telling you about. The cook would come out on the back porch, and the chickens were free-range chickens. And Leo would be lying on the back porch in the sun, and she'd point to a chicken. And that dog, don't ever think they're not smart, because she'd point to a chicken, and that dog would rise up, jump off the porch, and run at the chicken she's pointing at and clamp on it and bring it back to her, mouthful of chicken. And they'd have chicken. So I was sitting there during several visits, and I was sitting there whittling, and there's a water pump out there. You can see the pump there too. I was sitting there on that pump one particular day, and I saw Leo come trotting around the corner of the house. He trots around the corner of the house. He stopped. He looked around. There's a chicken over there close to him. He ran over, clamped on that chicken, and took off into the woods. And I went to the cook and I said, I believe that Leo has gone into business for himself. But in '59, when I gave up farming, I'd tried farming for 5 years and was not. There are those who tell you that I was a failure, but I will tell you that I just wasn't successful, and decided to sell the farm equipment and move into St. Louis, where I began working with Boggs and Grant selling real estate, which was a mistake. I couldn't sell ice water to people in Hades, but I tried it. And Leo, the Dents had moved into their town home there on Seri Street, 4th and Seri Street, the house that Julia and I were married in. And they were going, Mrs. Dent has died by now, and there's only the youngest Dent girl and Mr. Dent. And they moved into the townhouse in St. Louis. Julia and I were living at Whitehaven. And Mr. Dent wanted to take the dog, didn't want to take the dog into St. Louis, and Julia and I were moving into St. Louis too, and an overseer was going to control the farm or live on the farm. Well, my son Buck, second son, was very attached to Leo, and he was in tears. You know, he's just a tot. He's in tears over Leo being someplace else. And we finally convinced him, we prevailed on him, that Leo would be better off living in the country than he would in town. And then Buck has the idea, well, I'll sell him. If that's the case, I'll sell him. And I'll sell him to grandfather, Dent. So grandfather, being the kind grandfather that he was, when Buck said, I've got a deal, Grandpa, I want to tell you, I got a deal. I want to say you something. And Mr. Colonel Dent said, and what would that be, Buck? He said, I want to sell you Leo. Well, Leo was his dog. But he said, well, yes, Buck, I think you're being a very wise businessman. And how much do you want for the dog? He said, $10. Well, that's $10. At that time, $10 was probably more than a month's wages for a working man. And Colonel Dent swallowed a little bit, thinking, how do I handle this? Because I don't want to hurt the boy's feelings. I like the entrepreneurial spirit, but the dog ain't worth $10. And so I was listening to this, bemused, and I said, Buck, I think that might be a little too much to ask for Leo. Well, what do you think is a good price? And I said, how about $2.50, which was still a lot of money for the dog, but you know what you do with grandchildren. And I said, suggest $2.50. And so Buck turned and said, $2.50 and not a penny less. So grandfather said, well, I think that's a fair bargain. I know that dog to be a mighty fine dog. Yes, sir, he's a mighty fine dog, and I will happily pay you $2.50, and the money changed hands. And Buck no longer cried over the loss of Leo. So that's Leo the dog. Let me see what else Julia wrote here for me to tell you about. Cincinnati. I was charged with, one person had told me in good humor, asked me once after the war, General Grant, and of course it was mock seriousness, he said, General Grant, why is it that Cincinnati, your fine horse, always looks so fine, and you look a mess? And I took it in the humor in which it was intended, and I said, well, Cincinnati has 3 grooms. I have myself to dress every morning. So that might be why Cincinnati looks so good. Let me see. She wrote down, I wish she hadn't, golf. There's a new game called golf. You probably haven't heard of it, but golf. And there's a little ball, That's too big. Little ball that you take sticks, clubs, and you knock the ball across the countryside. And you're aiming for a little hole for the ball to go in. Now, when I took my world, Julia and I took our world tour, we went to St. Andrews, Scotland, which is where I understand the game of golf originated. And it may not have, I believe that you have been there, but they're mighty proud of that. Don't tell them it didn't begin there. They get real testy if you challenge that. And they invited the ex-President Grant to go out and play some golf. I'd never played golf. I hadn't even heard of golf. So I went out to play golf. And they gave me, they call it a club. Looked like a stick to me with a little thing on the end of it sticking out. And he said, the ball is teed up, General. And I said, yes, I see that. Here's your club. I took my club. And they said, you hold it just so. Just so. It's important how you hold it. Just so. And they said, you address the ball. And I said, hello, how are you? And they said, that's good humor, Mr. President. Yes, we've heard that before, but that's good humor. And I said, all right, what do I do now? And they said, you hit the ball. Well, how far? And they laughed and said, well, why don't you hit it just as far as you can? And I said, all right. So I addressed the ball, and I swung mightily, and I just moved there. Ball's still there. Straight faces all around me. They knew I'd never done this. So they said, address the ball again. So I went up, and I didn't say my quip the second time. So I got down and said, am I holding it correctly? And he said, yes, you are, Mr. President, General. Okay, and they said, move your knees. And they gave me a little lesson here. And I went back, and I swung again, and I just moved there again. A great swoosh. And it's still there. Now, they're beginning to have to stifle some smirks at this time. Nobody wants to laugh at the ex-president not hitting the ball, but they couldn't help it. So they said, well, try it again. I said, I'm not having much success with this. They said, try it again. All right. So I addressed the ball. Apparently that's very important in the game of golf. You address the ball. So I addressed the ball, I got the stick, and I went back and I thought, I'm going to knock it into the Atlantic Ocean. And nothing, the ball's still there. By this time, they're just openly laughing. So I straightened myself up and I walked over to I think they call him the president of the club, St. Andrews Golf Course. It's right there on the ocean. Beautiful place. Go there if you have an opportunity. It's cold and windy, but go there. And I gave the club back to the president of the club. And he said, what do you think, Mr. President? What think you of the game of golf? And I said, well, it seems like it'd be a real good way to get exercise. As I walked back into the clubhouse and the ball was still comfortably seated on the tee. So that was my golf experience. Oh, Julie's got a number of things listed here for me. Let me see. I told you about the phrenologist reaction. Oh, the Central Mississippi. I didn't know, Julie, knew anything about that. The Central Mississippi Railroad Campaign. Well, you may know it as the Vicksburg Campaign. What a nice family picture. So, on November the 2nd of 1862, I began the Vicksburg Campaign when I sent a telegram to Major General Henry Halleck and told him I proposed to move down the Mississippi Central Railroad to go into Jackson, Mississippi, and then wheel to the right and take the Vicksburg Railroad. It's Vicksburg is something else railroad that goes from Jackson, Mississippi, a beeline into Vicksburg. Then they transfer the cars to ferries, take them across the Mississippi, and they go into Louisiana on the opposite side. And Mr. Davis has said that Vicksburg is the nailhead that holds the two halves of the keg together, the Western Theater of the Confederacy across the Mississippi, or the Trans-Mississippi Theater, and then the Western Theater. The Trans-Mississippi, you see, has hundreds of thousands of hogs to feed a very hungry Confederate army. They've got thousands of cattle to feed a hungry Confederate army, and all the leather goods that an army needs. Not to mention 50 to 100,000 men that they need to fight for the Confederacy. So that Mississippi River divides Western Theater from Trans-Mississippi Theater, and the Trans-Mississippi Theater was absolutely critical to the Confederacy. We had to take Vicksburg. Now, Davis said, the nailhead or that holds the two halves of the keg together. Mr. Lincoln has said, Vicksburg is the key. And it was. Vicksburg is the key, and we cannot win the war until that key is firmly in our waistcoat pocket. And it turned out, as I was ascending the ranks, that I was charged with taking Vicksburg. Well, there's a little bit of a start and stop, and something of some humor. We had decided to go down the Mississippi Central, as I said. Mississippi Central parallels the Mobile in Ohio, but it angles into Jackson. And I thought, well, I'll just use a railroad that's already there and transport troops and materials. Easily done. Don't like the long supply line, but trains will move fast, and we'll just move down the Mississippi Central. And I began stockpiling all of my supplies in Holly Springs. You may have heard of it, Holly Springs, Mississippi. It's about 20 miles south of Memphis, Tennessee. And I was building up all of my supplies. I had about $7 million worth of supplies. I had enough supplies to move an army of 40,000 men, feed them, feed the horses and mules, which were tens of thousands of them, and ammunition, supplies, medical supplies to feed and care for a 40,000 man army. So Holly Springs became a supply depot. Well, in the machinations of trying to send Sherman down the Mississippi to take Walnut Hills, which is just it's the northern border of Vicksburg and its hills, facing swampland to the river. And that's where I sent Sherman to go through the swamps, over the Walnut Hills, and take Vicksburg from the north. While I went over and went down the Mississippi Central Railroad, and I was also going to meet Sherman there at Walnut Hills. Well, on December the 19th of 62, Nathan Bedford Forrest, and our Confederate vet, may well have been with Forrest when he made that raid on Jackson, Tennessee. Now, Hood is sitting, or Braxton Bragg. Nobody likes Braxton Bragg. I don't think Braxton Bragg likes Braxton Bragg. But Braxton Bragg is over in the Chattanooga area. And he sent Forrest on December 19th into Jackson, Tennessee. Now, Jackson, Tennessee is 90 miles northeast of Memphis. And it's about 50 miles north of Pittsburgh Landing and 20 more miles into Corinth. So it's about 70 miles south of Corinth, which is close to Holly Springs. So Forrest goes in and raids Jackson, Tennessee, and destroys about 40 miles of telegraph wire. So that eliminates my communication. See, my way of getting supplies and men or communicating with St. Louis, which is the headquarters now, is going up the river, the Mississippi, or going up the Mobile and Ohio Railroad. That's how I get supplies and men. And that's my main communication, the telegraph wire up the railroad. Forrest destroyed 40 miles of telegraph wire. It took about a month to replace all that wire and get the telegraph working again. But he also tore up several miles of the railroad. So at about 6 o'clock in the morning to about noon, Bedford Forrest completely destroyed my land-based supply line to move on Vicksburg or Jackson, Mississippi. The next morning, on December the 20th of 62, Earl Van Dorn, the dashing ladies' man Earl Van Dorn, led 3,500 cavalry soldiers. It was the most, I submit to you, it was the most effective cavalry raid in the entire war. Now, there are several. I'd like to tell you Grierson's raid was the most successful, and it would be arguably the most successful, but I submit to you that the Van Dorn raid on Holly Springs on December the 20th of 62 is the most successful raid in the war because Van Dorn, and can you imagine hearing 3,500 horses at a gallop? You could hear it probably for a mile, if not further. But at 5 a.m., Van Dorn led 3,500 men in, well, surprisingly enough, they called that street, that road now, Van Dorn, into Holly Springs, caught my men pretty much asleep, the commander particularly, 6th Wisconsin, and in a pitched fight there for a couple of hours. They took Holly Springs, took 1,500 men prisoner of our men, and completely destroyed all of my supplies. They burned everything. They burned the railroad cars. They even burned the locomotives that were there. Tore up all the tracks in front of the burned out locomotives and all the tracks behind the burned out locomotives. Completely stopped me in my tracks. I couldn't move. There was no need. I couldn't move the arm. I couldn't feed them. Not a day. Couldn't feed the men. Couldn't feed the horses. So I had to move back to about 20 miles north to Grand Junction, Tennessee. So why I say it's the most successful cavalry raid in the war, it's the only cavalry raid in the war that completely stopped a significant major military campaign. It stopped me standing amidst the burning rubble of supplies, and I had to pull back. So it's the only raid that stopped a major campaign. Well, as we were pulling back, I had to encounter something else. What am I supposed to feed 40,000 men? And probably 30,000 mules and horses. What am I supposed to feed them? Got no forage, got no food, got nothing. Well, the folks there in Holly Springs, the powers that be, the local leadership, they came in the next morning. Now, what I had determined was, now Sherman said you got to retreat back to Memphis. I said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that because that will not bode well with the northern newspapers. See, they'll blast it as a major federal defeat, and President Lincoln can't take that kind of disaster publicity. We're going to make a strategic, slow withdrawal back to Grand Junction, and then we're going to go that 50 miles to the west into Memphis and regroup for this campaign in the spring. But right now, we're going to pull back 20 miles or so to Grand Junction. And what I want you to do, see, I remembered what Winfield Scott had done in the Mexican War when we marched, I think it's 700 miles, from Veracruz on the coast to Mexico City, through Mexico, no supplies. We lived off the land. First time it had ever been done that I know of in military history. But Scott said two things. We can live off the land, get what you need as we go through the countryside, but don't take it all. Leave those people something to survive. Because when the war is over, these people need to be our friends. So don't take everything they've got and have them starving, but take what you need. Leave them something. And I remembered what Scott had done. I said, what we're going to do, call my staff in, and we're going along that Mississippi Central Railroad into Tennessee. And I said, go send foragers out 15 miles on each side of the line of march. So you got a 30-mile wide swath of bummers and foragers going out to get food, to feed that army. And those were the orders. And I said, don't take everything. I echoed General Scott. I said, when this war is over, these people have got to be our countrymen again. And we don't want to make things any worse on them than it will be. So 15 miles either side of the railroad. Well, the country, the leaders in the county there at Holly Springs came in, and they were hooking their thumbs in their waistcoats, and they're just all a smile. And they said, well, what you gonna do now, Grant? What you gonna do now? You ain't got no food, have you? We pretty much, Van Dorn pretty much done you in, didn't he, General? Pretty much done you in. And I said, yes, he did. Destroyed everything. Major sit back. Well, what you gonna do now, General? How you gonna feed those men? And I said, what we're gonna do is I'm sending foragers out 15 miles on either side of the line of march, the railroad track, and we're going to take what we need. It's amazing how fast those countenances changed. Those smiles quickly turned into frowns. That line went down, and those thumbs hooked in the waistcoats, they came out. What are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to do? And I said, well, I'll tell you what, since Van Dorn was not courteous enough to leave us enough to eat, to get out of your town, we're going to have to take what we need. He should have been kinder and left us something to eat. But he didn't. So we're going to take what we need to feed 40,000 men and all the horses and mules, all the king's men and all the king's horses. So what you should do, I would think, is move 16 miles outside of the line of march. And you'll be okay, I think. So they left, and they were greatly disgruntled. And I remembered the lesson that General Scott had taught me in the Mexican War. But I also learned another lesson. My foragers and bummers came back in, and we had three, it was like the loaves and fishes on the Sermon on the Mount. They came back in with 3 times the food that we had been supplied by the government, and much better food than had been supplied by the government. And I found out that we can do this. We can live off the land and actually live pretty well. So that's what I did when I went into Vicksburg when we crossed at Bruinsburg. But that was my railroad Holly Springs disaster, and moving 16 miles outside the line of march. Oh, let's see, Mississippi Railroad. Oh, yeah. My 25-foot jump. When I was about 12 years old, I was out with my chums out there in the woods around here somewhere. I don't recall where it was. But I'd been scouting the area, living here. And we were talking. Thank you, Lieutenant. Be seated. I was just reminded of the time. Isn't it wonderful to have good staff? Thank you, Lieutenant. So I'll tell you this little anecdote, and I'll bring my remarks to a close. While I was quiet, Didn't say much. I wasn't dumb. I was always thinking. And we were out in the woods playing one day, and I told one of my friends, I've been waiting for an opportunity to do this. And I told one of my friends, I'll bet you, I don't even recall what the wager was, but I'll bet you I can jump 25 feet in one jump. And of course they laughed and scratched. And, yeah, you can't do that. I said, I bet you, put your money where your mouth is. I can jump 25 feet in one jump. And of course with my little short legs, they thought he'd be good to make 6 or 7 feet. So the bet was made, hands were shook, and they said, all right, Grant, let's see you do it. And I said, come. And I led them a short way through the woods to the creek. And I'd already, of course, checked it out. The water down below, I knew how deep it was, up to my waist. Little mud at the bottom. And I stepped off that bank and dropped 25 feet into the water. And I looked up and I said, see, 25 feet, one jump. Now, of course, that made them the wiser for betting with me in the future, but I did collect that bet. Now, Susan, come out, Susan, our mistress of ceremonies, has been motioning to me. My lieutenant said, General, your time grows short, and I need to bring my remarks to a close. And I want to tell you how pleasant it is to pass a time of day with you. This place remained my home.
Now, we did say...
Thank you, thank you.
With that said, we did save just a few minutes for some questions.
I'll be happy to answer questions. Have you any? Yes, Colonel. Newly minted Colonel Salyer. Could I talk about my speeding ticket in Washington? I did not get a speeding ticket, but the story is, Colonel, thank you for bringing that up. The story is that I was in Washington City and driving my buggy, and it's well known that I like fast horses. And it was my custom to drive about Washington early in the mornings and whip up a good trot. And on one particular morning, one of the local Washington, D.C. police officers, a black fellow, Washington had black cops at that time, and that's a new term, a British term, comes from coppers over in England. But this particular officer stopped me and said, you've been speeding. Well, he pulled up and yelled, pull over, you've been speeding, as he's riding his horse. And I dutifully pulled over, and when he rode up beside me about to dismount, he saw who I was. And he said, oh, well, no, Mr. President, because I was a sitting president. And I said, don't tell me no. What's the charge? He said, well, you were speeding. You were going too fast. Well, what's that fine? He said, $20. But I'm not going to write you a ticket. Mr. President, I'm just not going to. I said, yes, you will. And he said, I will not. And I said, who's your superior officer? Take me to him. He said, yes. And he was respectful. He said, yes, sir, follow me. So we rode to the station house, tied up my horse, walked in there and talked to the desk sergeant. And he said, of course, he saw who I was. He said, well, Mr. President, what do we owe this to? And I said, I've got a fine to pay. And the officer there with you said, no, he doesn't. What was he doing? The officer said, well, he was speeding, and it's a $20 fine. And the desk sergeant, and he refuses to let me write him a ticket, or to let me not write him a ticket. And the desk sergeant said, well, Mr. President, no, we don't want to write you a ticket. And I said, you've got to write me a ticket. I was speeding. I owe a ticket. And he said, we won't do that. And I said, how much is the fine? And he said it would be $20. And I put $20 on the counter, and I said, I'm going to pay my fine whether or not you write me a ticket. So I'm the only so far out of 18, 19 with Hayes in office, I'm the only sitting president to ever be cited with a traffic citation for speeding, although I didn't actually get the ticket, but I insisted to pay the fine. Another legend put to rest. Who else? Yes, sir.
I'm just curious as to why your parents are very pretty close cemetery, Cincinnati instead of 173.
Why are my parents buried in Spring Grove Cemetery? Well, because they were living in Covington, Kentucky, just across the river at the time. And Spring Grove is it's the place to rest eternally. And my father died in 73, mother died in 83, and she was in New Jersey with my sister Jenny, who had married Abel Corbin, who was a crook. But she died living with her. And I determined that father was buried at Spring Grove, and then I determined that mother would be buried beside father. And at her funeral, I called the preacher aside and I said, "You will not mention me in any way, except that I was her first son, and that is the only mention that will be made of me." Good question. Yes, sir, in the back. What was the longest train logistically that I had in my campaigns? That would have been crossing the Rapidan River on about midnight on May the 3rd into May the 4th. I had 4,000 wagons, took 55,000 horses and mules. And, because it was 3,500 wagons of supplies and forage, 500 wagons of medical supplies and ammunition. They put them in the same wagon, ammunition and medical supplies. But there was a total of 4,000 wagons, 55,000 horses and mules, and about 5,000 head of cattle. We took the cattle with us and butchered them as the men needed the meat. The wagon train, if you had put them from mule to wagon and lined them up, it would have been 90 miles long. The first wagon would have been rolling into the city limits of Richmond, while the last wagon was still in the city limits of Washington City. 4,000 wagons, 90 miles long. That was the longest. Oh, and we also built 5 pontoon bridges across the Rappahannock. There were 2, Germanna Ford and Ely's Ford, stone bridges. I had the pioneers, they're rumbling about naming themselves combat engineers. That may not happen. But I had my pioneers put 5 more pontoon bridges across the Rappahannock. And we took 110,000 men moving at one time across 7 bridges in a 90-mile long. Now, they were never all lined up, but there were 7 bridges with a steady stream of wagons. Good question. Who else would have a question of me? Yes, ma'am. What did I think of Joshua Chamberlain? He was a tremendous, in fact, he and Bedford Forrest on opposite sides bookend the true essence of a soldier. Now, your question is Chamberlain, and I will address that, but I must needs bring in Bedford Forrest, because Chamberlain and Forrest were opposites they were on opposing sides. Chamberlain and Forrest are opposites in that Chamberlain was one of the best educated men in the United States Army. He taught every class at Bowdoin College except math. And he would have taught that, but somebody else came in and took it. But he was a master of several languages, spoke several fluently. So he was an extremely well-educated man. Bedford Forrest could read and write. Now, he's characterized as being illiterate and stupid. Don't believe it. He was literate. He could read and write, but not well. So while he was literate, he was not very literate. So you've got Opposite sides, Yankee rebel, you got college professor and man who can read and write. But you've got two men who had no military experience, and both joined the Army and had natural ability, and both quickly rose. Forrest became a lieutenant general, and I named Chamberlain as one of the two battlefield commissions that I did. Before we left on that magnificent move with that long wagon train, I was given authority by Stanton and President Lincoln to promote on the field men to general rank. And at Petersburg, Chamberlain was hit in the groin, and I was told it would be a good idea if you appointed him, he was colonel, if you named him, promoted him, battlefield promotion to general, because he's not going to make it through the night. And we can tell him before he dies, you've made general. Then he had the bad taste to live. But I was proud to promote Joshua Chamberlain. Both men ascended to the heights of not just military rank, but military capability. Chamberlain and Forrest were brilliant strategic men, tactical men, both very courageous men under fire many times, both of them wounded multiple times. And after the war, both of them went back to civilian lives. Both, like Cincinnatus, they beat their swords into plowshares and went directly back to civilian life, and both became very successful men. In fact, when Forrest died in 1977, he had 2,000 black people. The Pole Bearers Association led his funeral procession. He became a civil rights advocate and became a Christian, and there were some 5,000 people at his funeral. 2,000 of them were black people in Memphis, where he had been a slave trader before the war. But 2,000 black people led his funeral procession. That's how much he changed. But Chamberlain went on to be 4-time governor of Maine. Very successful man. Won the medal, ultimately was awarded the Medal of Honor. So I think he was courageous. He was naturally talented to be a soldier. He learned his craft on horseback while he was commanding men, displayed great courage, displayed great leadership, and was a fine, fine man. I think a great deal of Joshua Chamberlain. One or two more?
I believe that should conclude unless there's something extremely pressing. And we'd prefer, obviously, that it would stick to maybe his siblings, his life with Julia, or his sense of humor, as we spoke about today. There's always future programs, and we'd be happy to hear your ideas on those future programs if you'd like to hear anything specific about any of these topics.
I'd be happy to address whatever you'd like to hear. Well, got an arm up. Yes, ma'am. I'll address what are my thoughts about Sherman and the burning of Atlanta. First thing I'll say is Sherman was not the only one burning Atlanta. The Confederates torched the rail yards with the ammunition as Hood was evacuating. Sherman didn't start the fires. Sherman was in there trying to put them out. Now, some of his men did start fires. There's no doubt about that. But what the part of that story that's not told is the fire in Atlanta started when Hood was evacuating and set fire to the ammunition at the Great Atlantic and Western Railroad. So it shouldn't have been burned. Sherman participated certainly, but Sherman gets a bad rap on Atlanta. The Confederates started the fire. A lot of Sherman's men were trying to put it out. But put that down for a potential topic, and I will address it in far greater detail.
Yeah, as I said, we're always open to new ideas and things that you guys would like to see. We're always more than happy to have those given to us. But I think for this morning, that concludes the program. Again, thanks to Dr.
Thanks
Kirkfield.
for coming. This place remain my home. And I will be about my business.
As I mentioned earlier, there will be lunch served across the street at the Methodist Church. You're welcome to join there, and the general will be there to cut his cake shortly. He might mill around a bit and have some private conversation, but he will be over there shortly to cut his cake. If you do not want to go to the Methodist Church, obviously you're welcome to any other place in Georgetown. There's plenty of places to eat. And then after lunch at about 1 o'clock, all of our sites will be open and free to the public. So the Boyhood Home, the school, as well as obviously all of our murals and the Native Son statue are going to be open. So please walk around town. And then tomorrow on April 27th, our new partners, the Grant Birthplace, is having a birthday celebration at Point Pleasant. It is his actual birth date. It begins with a presentation by our own Greg Roberts. Greg, are you still out there somewhere? So Greg right over there. And Dr. Kurt Fields will be back as Ulysses S. Grant at the Grant Memorial Church at 2 p.m., followed by a free tour of the Grant Birthplace and birthday cake again. So lots of opportunity to get birthday cake. Remember, in the rear of the auditorium, you can join the Land of U.S. Grant, purchase a souvenir, or if you wish to make a donation, we'd be happy to have that. The best way to keep track of our programs, like the General Speaks, that will be presented on October 18th, 2025, yes, this fall, and Grant Days 26 on April 23rd through the 26th, is to join the Land of U.S. Grant to get our newsletters or to follow us on Facebook or the webpage. Thank you again for joining us today. Good afternoon, and please walk around historic Georgetown where Grant walked as a boy.
Our beliefs matter. They're reflected in our words and actions. At First State Bank, we believe in treating people well, and have since 1884. Listening, caring, looking out for each other. It's what people deserve. It's what a real local bank does. While lots of things have changed over the years, our belief in you hasn't. First State Bank, built on belief.
More than a century of service. Let that sink in for a moment. For more than 100 years, since 1908, and through 4 generations of family-owned business, Georgetown Marble and Granite has stood firm in our community. They've helped thousands of families pay their respects and have memorialized so many lives gone, but not forgotten. When that difficult time comes, Georgetown Marble and Granite will be there to assist you too. Visit their location on East North Street in Georgetown or call 937-378-6314. Insurance protection for you and your family. John Wood Insurance has helped thousands of families with their insurance needs since 1891. For service you can trust, contact John Wood Insurance in Georgetown at 937-378-4124, in Owensville at 513-732-2600, in West Union at 937-544-5505, or in Peebles at 937-587-2246. That's John Wood Insurance.
Our mission is to educate, inspire, and honor.
This is the sound of honor roaring. This is the sound of a generation rising above.
We want to be involved in the education of young people so that they can take the stories that our pilots tell and realize their own dreams.
The Commemorative Air Force honors the heroes of yesterday while educating and inspiring the heroes of tomorrow. You can learn more at soundsofhistory.org.
Thank you for tuning in. Rewatch this video and many more on demand at goodguysradiotv.com.